podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Michael, welcome to All Across America.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So you're the interim dean of Boston University School of Public Health. You're also a primary care physician to your patients when they need to go see the doctor. You're that guy. What drew you to the work, and why'd you decide to write about it?
Oh, well, the work I've been doing now for decades. I was always a science person. I was always a people person. Medicine seemed like a good way of combining the two. I decided to do primary care when it wasn't so popular way back when. It's now on people's tongues all the time, but back then it was a pretty rare thing to do primary care. But it seemed like a good way to meet a lot of people and do interesting things. I'm trained, therefore, as an internist, so I get to cover the whole body. It's very general. I enjoyed that very much. And so that's how my sort of medicine career started. And then probably pretty parallel to that, I started I guess I would say a second career in writing. I've written 15 books and I've written 6 novels, and A Living, which is what we're talking about today, is my 9th book of nonfiction. So some people say, "Oh, that's an avocation." And I go, "No, it's not an avocation. When you write 15 books, that's a job." And
Yeah.
and so it doesn't pay all the bills. That's what I do medicine for, but it has been something that I've loved and spent a lot of time with. So those are the two loves of my life, and this is a book that combines the two, right? So I've written a couple of books really about conversations with my patients. I wrote one about 4 years ago, and this is the cousin of that. The one 4 years ago was called Broke, and it was really talking to people about money. And I have a lot of patients in the inner city who don't have a lot of money. It was a large part of our conversations, so I started writing some of them down with patients' permission. And then from that, I think I wrote at least one other book in between, and then I came back to sort of hearing patient voices, which I'm interested in, and what this book is stylistically handles. And so this time I write about physical labor, as you know. So a lot, again, of my people do physical work, and that's always interested me because I'm so bad at physical work. But you guys really have a lot to teach me, like, tell me what you do all day, and when you ask people what they do all day, it's interesting. So,
Wow.
some of it down, and then I sort of framed it, as you know, around some general themes that people have when talking about their work, which is identity and what you lose and gain and your connections to people and how work structures your day. And so I organized the book around that. And then I sort of added, as you know, some short essays about sort of public health topics, because I'm a public health person and I always try to look for ways to sort of see the individual patient, but also think of them as sort of part of a larger society. So that's how the book came about.
Wow. And how do you get your patients to open up to you? I mean, I feel like for most primary care physicians, it's very much they're wheeling in a computer, they're getting as much information down as quickly as possible. Do you spend longer with patients than your average doctor?
So I would say I'm lucky in a bunch of ways. One is that that I have a control of my schedule so that I can spend more time or less time with people depending on what their needs are in that particular day. Second, I never take a computer into the room.
Good for you.
I consider that rude, and I'm old school in that way. Like, no, you're gonna have to talk to me, and if can't remember it, I'm gonna have to write it down with a pen on a piece of paper, and then I will go to my computer and put all the things in. So there's that. Um, 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 I've been doing it for a long time, so I know a lot of patients for a long time, and so people talk to you over a long time, right? I mean, the things that I talk about in the book, you don't come in and the person says to you, "I have a sore throat," and I say to them, "Tell me all about your job," right?
Right.
Right? That's not the way it works. It works that you take care of what people need right away, and then you try to get to know them, because the things that they tell you in these broader conversations are often things that come back to be useful to you and to
Right.
them in their care. Since, as you know, half of primary care is mental health, at least. And since
Sure.
work is so tied into people's mental health and levels of stress, et cetera, that it's a good investment in time. So I'm lucky. I'm not a full-time primary care doctor who work their butts off seeing lots of patients in corporations, and I, because I'm old and because I do other things with my time, in terms of research and other things around the world of medicine, that my time with primary care patients is really very precious to me,
Yeah.
and I have a little more control of it than the sort of run-of-the-mill doctor who's grinding through patients. So,
Gotcha. And do you see that given that a lot of your patients have blue collar jobs, that a lot of their ailments are work related?
oh, yeah, certainly more than people who don't have those kinds of jobs, for sure. I mean, the book, as you know, this sort of image that I often talk about. So just to tell your listeners sort of what the structure of the book is, it's really sort of sometimes one paragraph, sometimes one page vignettes about individual people, often with them talking, sometimes always with them talking, sometimes with me inserting myself to ask a question or reshape it or tell the reader what I'm thinking at the time. And often, so they're very short. You can open to really any page in the book and just start there and just see
Yeah.
those people on that page. And there are some people who go through the book, but mostly it's sort of one offs of people sort of talking about their lives and particularly their jobs. And often I talk about or remark on, if you've noticed, their hands, because so
Yes.
much is what they do with their hands. It's, after all, it's called manual labor. And so the people that I see, depending on their jobs, they just do, dangerous things, right? I mean, truthfully, pain is the price of working. And people are gonna be in pain, and that has all sorts of long-term ramifications in terms of, um, you know, pain medications. In this era, it leads
Yeah.
directly into the topic of pain medications and
Yeah.
and who's taking them and the risks of taking them. And And on the flip side of that is, of course, the not working. So people who don't work because they have too much pain or too many problems with pain medications and they don't work, that causes its own mental health problem as well as
Yeah.
obviously financial and other problems. So yeah, I see people who have a lot of physical ailments due to their work. Most generally it's pain. Could be other
Yeah.
things, obviously, but
Yeah. What do you say to, and I have a lot of younger listeners and, with Gen Z, there's really this talk about turning towards the trades. What do you say to them in terms of, for folks who are teenagers that are, I remember that time I felt invincible. And in terms of, safety gear and eye protection, from head to toe, what have you seen? What do you recommend? What's your words of advice for young people getting into the trades?
well, there's so many different trades at this point. I mean, there's some jobs that are, very physical, and it's hard to explain to somebody who lifts beer kegs for liquor store deliveries all day, to be careful all the time and bend and get help and don't do things all on your own and don't overestimate yourself. And then you get tired at the end of the day and you get dehydrated and fall and a 200-pound barrel comes at you because you've slipped, et cetera. I mean, so there's obviously sort of being awake to those kinds of things, but that's very different from an electrician who can burn themselves or truthfully kill themselves with a wrong circuit.
Yeah.
And that's different from a person who makes sailboats, who, is dealing with a different kind of dust in the air and
Respirators.
doesn't want to wear masks, etc. So certainly over the long term, young people understand that they're not immortal. And it's very striking. Some of these injuries to young people are very you know, disabling and for long
Yeah.
periods of time, and it's sort of shocking to people. So certainly any care people can take, I like the idea of that.
Yeah. We were, I think, touching on opioids earlier, and my cousin was a DEA agent undercover for many years, and he said that most of his sources were former construction or current construction workers who had hurt themselves on the job, were prescribed opioids, and then turned to the streets to fuel their habit. What has been your approach to those sort of pain relief in general?
Yeah, well, I first want to make clear that, the only people who've had opioid problems in America in the past years, where 100,000 people die a year, is
Yeah,
are not people who are manual laborers, right? It's people who are lawyers and
sure.
mortgage
Yes.
brokers and nurses and you know, people who are salespeople. So these kinds of problems are not exclusive to people with manual labor, but
Right.
certainly work can that can physically disable you um, is really notorious, right, for causing opioid problems. Been a lot of work on research on the opioid problems in the construction trades, and that's absolutely true. Um, and that a lot of people leave those trades, leave work because of their opioid problems, right? I mean, about 7 or 8 years ago, which was sort of the height of the opioid epidemic in the United States, you know, the head of the National Economic Advisors Council basically calculated that about half of all non-working men were taking pain medicines on a daily basis. So let me say that again. Half of non-working men in America were taking pain meds on a daily basis. And, when we talk about the decline of the male labor force, the despair of the labor force, the out of workness of young men in the country, it was very tied up with these ideas of pain and the ideas of treating that pain. And, that's been a dramatic thing in this generation for the past, decade or so when we've had these
Yeah.
historic highs of opioid deaths.
Right. So how do you approach somebody in pain?
Oh, you're going way off topic from the book, Mark. Now you're asking
All
now
right, all
you're
right. No,
asking no, you're asking me medical things, which is fine. No, it's fun.
yeah, okay.
I've obviously I wrote a book about 10 years ago, probably one of my best-selling books called The Addict, which
Okay.
is really so, um I have my research. So I'm primarily a academic researcher. I work in hospitals doing research, and my research for the past 20 years has been about pain and medications for pain, opioids.
Wow.
And so, um, this is very familiar research material to me, as well as what I
Yeah.
have often therefore seen in my primary care office as well. And so, um, yeah, pain is a problem in the United States, and from the medical side of the fence, the problem really is there are no great non-addictive pain medications. So
Yeah.
there's a jump for people, for all of us, for you, for me, for anybody from, Tylenol and aspirin and Motrin all the way to opioids. So you go from this sort of low-level pain medication to this highly potentially addictive pain medicine, and there are not too many steps in between. And so that's what's caused a bit of the problem in addition to the overselling of those higher pain medicines and of course, the well documented by now demonstration that the industry, that the pharmaceutical companies that peddled those pain medicines did advertising to, unfortunately, non-skeptical and lazy doctors. So the combination of non-skeptical, lazy doctors and an industry pushing pills, really created this pill epidemic in the United States that's been written about in many wonderful books. And then that unfortunately led to the entrance of fentanyl, which you all have heard of, as
Yeah.
a opioid pain medicine that came in as primarily as recreational use, not as a prescribed medicine, but is so potent that people used it thinking they were gonna match what they were getting from their pills and died as a result of the unknowing use of this fentanyl that's coming to the country. And that's what's caused all the records to break over the past 10 years. So it's a problem for the industry, it's a problem for doctors, it's a problem for patients, and we're in a country in a lot of pain. If you look at sort of pain scales in the United States, self-reported pain scales compared to other countries, we're way off the board. And it's not all physical pain probably, it's also probably psychological pain that people describe as, you know, something that's uncomfortable and that causes them to do certain things or take certain meds that they might not wanna do.
Wow. I wanted to turn to a book that you had quoted. It talks a little bit about, I think, the reasoning behind the jobs that people have and how worthy they feel in the work that they do. And the book is called Bullshit Jobs, which was a seminal title that came out. I think it was a Princeton University professor who had wrote it. And you quote in saying that bullshit jobs are often white collar and salaried. Shit jobs are blue collar and hourly.
Yeah. Yeah, that was his line. That's David Graeber's book called Bullshit Jobs, which is really it's an interesting question because and it's one I think about a lot. What he meant by bullshit jobs were jobs that were not sort of personally satisfying. That they were jobs where at the end of the day, a person, working in a phone bank or selling mortgages, they do it often to make money. Sometimes there's some camaraderie and enjoyment of it, but at the end of the day, they often feel the product, they're not proud of the product that they've produced. And that's what he meant by bullshit jobs. And I think about this a lot because the people who I work with, who I said, make things, make cabinets, make sailboats, make houses, drop driveways, build, houses from the bottom up. You know, what I rarely hear from them is what my work isn't worthwhile. They're very proud. People who work with their
Yeah,
hands in general, unless you're on an assembly line doing the same thing again and again, which is its own terrible situation. But most people who do, sort of gig manual labor are quite proud of what they produce at the end of the day. And so I would never use the word bullshit jobs, even though they might be less well paid or what we sometimes call blue collar. I think that they often respect themselves in terms of their work. And I, as I said, wrote about them because I admire them. I mean, the jobs that the people do that I hear about are just interesting. Like, I don't know how to rebuild an engine, do you? I can't change my
right.
transmission. I can't build a house. Um, and that kind of work is a very richly labored skill, right? It's not only physical, but it's also mental to do electrical systems for a large building. That's not
Sure.
straightforward to take a 10-story building and put in the plumbing for it. So whenever I hear these things in my office, it's like, well, I'm extremely ignorant about a lot of the world. And that's good that a doctor's humbled about by these things. I mean, there are practical knowledge things that lots of people have that I don't have that frankly seem miraculous to me. Like every time I walk by one of these, giant apartment buildings going up with 15 stories, I go, how the hell do they bake in that house, that building? How is that going to stand up? How do they get through step by step of that? And um, so that's interesting to me and admirable, as I said.
And when speaking with your patients, were there themes that kept coming back to you over and over again?
Well, I just think I mean, and I think the things that I tried to divide the book into, how people think of their work in terms of their identity, um, how they think of working with family members. There are a lot of the trades who work with their parents and hand-me-down masons and hand-me-down plumbers and, people who are really tied in for generations. That's difficult for people. It's an interesting relationship to be able to do those things with your father day after day and what that means as you get older. So I think those things are themes that I think came up with. And then just to the sort of wide experiences that we have. We spend so much of our time working, right? We spend as much time working as sleeping. Certainly more than we spend talking to anybody in our lives. So
Right.
you know, you spend a lot of time at this thing and so it holds lots of meaning to people besides a paycheck, which is obviously essential to the work in general, but you know, it's where we have some of our greatest stresses and our greatest regrets and our greatest triumphs and our greatest frustrations. So all of those sort of, you know, very meaningful emotional things are part of this. So to me, you know, it's not only the sort of tell me about going up that wind turbine and changing the rotors at the top, which, you know, I'm scared of heights, so there's another one that I'm
Me
afraid
too.
of. And so, like, you know, but this sort of to me, it's interesting about this sort of structured mental work of it. And, um, and I like when people are proud of what they do. It's just fun to talk to those people.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's bigger job satisfaction between your blue collar patients and your more white collar patients?
I mean, in general, I don't know how to answer that in a sort of as a researcher, I don't wanna just extrapolate too much from my personal experience, but
Yeah.
no, I mean, I think people enjoy in general, if they're not the problem is that poverty, which I've written about a lot in a bunch of my books, is so, mind numbing that people who are really worried about money all the time are people who are not enjoying much of anything else. It just takes up a lot of bandwidth. And so usually white collar people have more money, maybe are a little maybe want a little more money, maybe not want a little more money, but feel the need to keep up a certain style. And so that's different from people who are really just trying to scrap by with three jobs. And
Right.
um so I don't know who enjoys it more. I mean, certainly people who, you know, again, not to romanticize manual labor, if you're working on an assembly line, you know, putting rubber bands into masks, it's not it's not enjoyable after a period of time. So, um, you know, manual labor is hard.
Yes, and I think we should distinguish between blue collar work that may be unskilled and much of blue collar work is highly, highly skilled work.
Yeah, I think so, and you know, the trade schools that are bigger in other countries and maybe making a bit of a comeback here in the United States, certainly the rise percentage-wise in people going to trade school in the United States is much higher over the past 8 or 10 years than people going to college, right? The college numbers are dropping off and the trade schools are going up. The trade schools are still a tiny amount of people in America, but there may be more. We, as a country, have never invested in that particular part of our economy, like a country like Germany, where it's very clear very early on that people do these sophisticated trade schools. And then often at 25 or 27, having learned to be an electrician, go back and become an electrical engineer. There's often sort of late changes in other
Interesting.
countries into what we would call white collar jobs, but starting through this trade school notion. And so, you know, we've just never invested in that in the United States. And so, um, and that's why, you know, the famous American sort of social mobility is a total myth at this point. People get stuck in in their jobs.
What's the solution for that?
Well, you know, I'm gonna say this because I believe it, but it's not of the moment, right? The solution is mostly government policy. And since we're in an era now where the dominant party seems to hate government, it's not a time to do this. They will invest nothing in this,
Mm,
and will in fact scrape much away that's in place, and they will say the private sector will take care of this, and the private sector will train people who they can train, and that's enough. And it's probably not enough. It's certainly not planning, and it leaves sort of large policies like the training for trade schools, you know, undermanned, underpersoned at the
Right.
moment. So, um, yeah. So I think that's the answer. I mean, there are lots of things that affect working people, again, that are politically where there's political meaning to the policies that are actually put into effect by our parties, right? We're the only country that doesn't have paid sick leave. So what does that mean? You have people who are quitting jobs or people who are working sick. And what does that mean? It means you go to a restaurant with somebody who's sick, chances are if you're a customer at that restaurant, you're going to be sick. Or you
Yeah.
have people dropping in and out of the workforce much more than other places. And so, you know, as a person who works in a public health school, who's the dean of a public health school, I'm interested not only in the individual patient in my office, but also in this sort of these large public policies. And
Yeah.
public policies are by nature political. And when we make political decisions at the polls, we are making decisions about the things we're talking about here. Are we going to have a country that, trains workers? Are we going to have a country that offers medical insurance? Are we a country, et cetera? These are not made up out of the blue. They are the policies of our politicians.
Can you talk a little bit about temporary disability? You had written about writing forms for folks that are facing hardship.
Yeah, it's a topic I don't really know a deep amount about. I often thought of maybe trying to write a book about it in some way, but there's this notion of people who are hurt, who have quote paid into the system, who are have available to them should they need it due to an injury, et cetera, some limited period of time, temporary, to claim payments at quite a high rate from what they were making or what they paid in for, you know, insurance purposes and get repaid. And so it's limited. It's not available to everybody. Um, it's um, it's a system that works well in some places and very much underpays in other places. It's not a sort of uniform system in any means. Um, and then it leaves on the table the question of sort of longer term disability and how that gets evaluated and what that means and et cetera. And this is going to come up in the Medicaid debate that is happening in the country right now in July of 2025, right? Who's a working person, who qualifies for Medicaid, um, who should qualify for it, et cetera. Those are all things that are sort of very much on people's minds these days.
So turning back to the vignettes, you wrote about a lot of different patients, but there was one patient that kept making an appearance, and that's the clamor. Can you talk about the clamor?
Yeah. So, as a writer, what you sometimes need to do is to pull a reader through the book. You need to have them, you know, have a relationship with at least one character, right? You don't read books that don't have a relationship with one character. So while this is a book that was meant to be sort of all sorts of work, right? I wrote about 100 different kinds of jobs in the book. So,
Right.
but I needed somebody who created a sort of skeleton that a reader could walk up the skeleton and hold on to the book. And so I chose a person whose primary job was clamming, which I live in the East Coast on the Atlantic Ocean and have people who work on the water. I have
Yeah.
deep sea fishermen, I have lobstermen, I have clammers. People actually go out and do those, and they're actually very hard, rough jobs. And this guy was a professional clammer and had been, since he was 18 years old and, had been taught by his grandfather. And it is a specific job to my sort of region, and so he was an interesting person because I just liked him. He was just one of these guys who was not nostalgic, um, you know, really liked to work hard, was proud of working hard, would tell me how many clams he brought in that week, who would, very open about things like that and the pricing of the clams and the how polluted the water was and how angry he was at the state for closing down his favorite clamming point, etc. So he was a talker. He was a hard worker. He was very proud, and and he had other sort of personal things going on, which, you know, he had children, he had women in his life. Clamming is hard to do all year round, so he often picked up other jobs. So how did he make do? Like in the winter when it was very cold to be on the water, he would snowplow. He spent time caring for elderly in his neighborhood for money or for rent. So he was just a person who I knew for a lot of years and just thought, um, I sort of enjoyed talking to him. So I made him the sort of centerpiece of the book. And then you sort of
Nice.
see he's one who gets followed over time and different things happen to him along the way in the book.
And, he was older at the, time of the book, and, I have a friend of mine who works at the Department of Public Works in my hometown, and I remember him saying that, I'm in my mid-40s now, and he said, "Look, your job probably has gotten easier as you've gotten older," and in many ways, he's right, and responsibility is more, but, in terms of the day-to-day, it can be easier, but what he had said for his work, it's the same as it ever was. When he was 22, picking up trash versus 20 years later, it's the same job. And how does that affect your older patients?
Well, I don't know that the technology of clamming has changed very much. I mean, I
Right,
I don't so some obviously the technology you have to keep up and others not. Um, I think you're asking a slightly different question, tell me if I'm wrong, which is sort of this one about almost about retirement. We sort of have this
sure.
sort of national retirement age of about 65. People sort of keep that in their mind, maybe 67 these days, where, you know, um, we think that we're headed toward that. It's interesting. I often talk to people about retirement, and some of these people think about retiring, and some of them just go, I'll never retire. But remember, you know, Social Security has been around since 1935, so it's 90 years old this year. And it was really intended to sustain people um, once they could no longer physically work. And so, that affects people differentially. It really depends on your occupation, right? I mean, a person sitting at a desk continued to work physically, well past 65. But, these people have my patients have less money and hard to depend on Social Security at 65. It doesn't really pay them enough to replace their current income, even though it's quite low. And, you know, do we change their retirement age? In some ways, the retirement age of a construction worker, it would make sense to make it lower, right? Because
Right, yeah.
they're sort of physically spent at whatever, 50 or 55, and yet here they are working to 60 or 65 or 75. So it really makes you, think about these things and what retirement needs are for these physically difficult jobs. And I don't have an easy answer for this. In some ways, in the 1950s, which was, only 20 years after Social Security, one in three Americans belonged to a union. And unions were often about this sort of retirement age and what you get paid after you retire.
Yeah.
And, now fewer than one in 10 Americans are in a union. So a lot of this sort of retirement talk, which used to be again, structured through union policies, has now been sort of disbanded and is in the wind. And so, I think part of that is, um, playing out in a bit of the income inequality we see in the United States, and this requirement to work harder and harder, even as you get older and older.
Yeah. What do you think is a as a public health doctor, what do you think is the number one public health issue right now, 2025, affecting folks in the blue collar community?
Well, I think well, it depends what we mean by health. And so if health is sort of life expectancy, some people call it, that's a sort of great societal measure of health, is the life expectancy of a country. It's hard for people to think outside of themselves. So again, public health asks you to not just think about yourself, but to think about your family or your town or your state or your country, right? Sort of a broad group of people. And one measure of sort of the health of a country is how long a new baby who's born today is going to live, right? A healthier country would mean a baby would live longer. Or put another way, a healthier country would be when you turn 35, the chances of you getting to 85 are higher, right? So there are measures of health that are life expectancy. There are measures of health that are disability related. So how many years do I get before I'm disabled? So I could live a long time, but if 20 of those years I'm disabled, is that healthy?
Yeah.
So it's hard to know. But from a sort of straight up numerical standpoint in America, by far the biggest health risk is obesity.
Yeah.
And obesity is just tied to everything from pain in your knees to cancer risk. And so it's a big deal and a very complicated, not easy to define or solve issue. And that's had a very interesting sort of metamorphosis over these past 5 years with these, drugs like Wegovy and those kinds of drugs that have really sort of, at least for a certain class of people, changed the obesity curve in the United States. But that by far is the biggest public health issue to my mind. There are other ones that are sexier, right? That are sort of on our mind, right? Guns, uh, drug overdoses, those things are sexier in the sense of they kill younger people. And so we think about them in a different way than obesity, which kills people in their 60s and 70s from chronic illness. Guns and drugs and motor vehicle accidents kill young people and
Yes.
and change the life expectancy of a country if they're very high. So all three of those are very high in the United States, right? Gun deaths and motor vehicle deaths and drug deaths are, you know, miles behind any other rich country in Europe or Asia. We're the worst on this, which is why our life expectancy is not good in the United States, why we're not good at this. And it's interesting if you look back at the history of life expectancy. Sorry, we're going off on a bit of a tangent, but
Please.
you know, in 1980, we had one of the top life expectancies in the United States, along with, Switzerland and Finland and Japan. And since 1980, we have gone right down the tubes, and we're now, probably 40th in the world. 35th or 40th. We're with countries that you couldn't imagine we're equal to in terms of life expectancy.
Right.
A lot of these wealthier countries have continued to rise. And part of that is sort of these young deaths from, as I said, you know, guns, suicides, overdoses, and motor vehicle accidents. So, the United States is a very unhealthy country in terms of life expectancy. There are other ways of thinking about health, but that's the easiest, simplest form because we can all imagine what that means. And life expectancy in the United States, to tie it back to some of the subjects I've written about, is probably driven primarily by poverty.
Yeah.
Right? So if you I mean, this a statistic in one of my other books that I talk about all the time is, if you were born in the richest county in the United States, so which is probably someplace in Virginia, if you were
Right.
born there, the chances you have a 20 year longer life expectancy than if you're born in the poorest county in the United States.
Right. I mean, we look at Fairfax County, Virginia, outside of DC versus McDowell County in Southwest, West Virginia, one
Right.
state over with significant differences in life expectancy. Yeah.
So that's a sort of shocking thing that we live in a
Yeah.
country and don't address this notion of, where you happen to be born dictates how long you're
Yeah.
going to live by 20 years. It's really a sort of shocking
Yeah.
thing that we don't talk about.
I mean, it's, the birth lottery in some respects,
Yeah.
but it's nature nurture as well. I mean, it brings in a much bigger question. Um, to keep it simple, question for you. Have you ever had a manual labor job?
Yeah, I have actually. I used to lay pipes in a farm on the field. I did
Mm,
irrigation on a farm for a period of time in my life. That was very hard. Um, and other than being a waiter, which is a manual labor that I write about in the book, which I've done also.
done, yeah.
Um, yeah,
I've done both, only waiting tables for money. Irrigation for my own house. Um, so you had a number of questions, and I thought maybe we could end with, and please take as long or as short as you want, and you outlined some of the questions that you ask your patients. Um, do you ever go to work sick?
yeah. What you'd like me to talk about why I asked that?
Yeah, yeah, or answer them yourself.
Um, Yeah, I don't think I go to work sick. No, I don't think I would do that very much anymore. Maybe at some point in my life, but I don't do that. Um, doesn't I'm not paid by the day, and so I don't lose the income for that day.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's a big deal for people
Right.
who are paid by the day, paid by the hour. Missing a day of work is, not
Missing a
good.
part of your paycheck. Yeah.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
big part of your paycheck, and so you gotta be really sick not to go, but it tells you something about, how they live, it tells you how much in terms of their savings, it turns out tells you a lot about sort of where they are in the basic needs of life scale, so I ask that, yeah.
What part of work do you like the most and hate the most?
Yeah, so that's often a way that gets you into sort of talking about, well, this is not a good job for you, or this is a job that you're now injured by. And so you may have to change directions. So let's see if we can identify the things that bring you pleasure, even if they're tiny, and things that you know, you don't like. Do you hate being around other people all day, right? There are people who go, "I don't ever wanna work with a crew of people. I'd rather work at Dunkin' Donuts doing the donut shift at 3 a.m. for all
Yeah.
the donuts because I don't have to see anybody and I have control of my life," right?
Yeah.
And there are other people who go, "Oh, man, I'll do anything to work with a crew," it's gonna distract me, it's gonna be fun, they're gonna drive me crazy, but I'll make friends, etcetera, etcetera. So yeah, it gives you some sense of a person.
And for you, what do you like most about your work?
Well, what I like most about my work is that I'm this very, very lucky person in that I have many different forms of work at this point in my life.
Yeah.
So I get to write books, which is a serious form of work for me. I get to mentor younger scientists at this point in my life, which I
Mm.
very much like. I get to do podcasts with you, which I think is fun and let people hear about my books and maybe buy them and read them or go to the library and get them and tell people about them. So I like hearing from readers who read my books.
Nice.
And I very much, like patience, which is, a very immediate satisfaction, unlike some of those other things. Books take years to write and people you mentor take years to develop. But, a patient, if you can really help them in one visit, that's a very excellent feeling, so I'm very lucky in that way.
What do you like least?
Um, I'm not really good at sitting on my butt for long periods of time, like, an office job would probably crush me very quickly, I would think. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I think that's probably the worst for me.
fair enough. What did you wanna be when you were 16?
Well, I certainly wanted to be a professional athlete. I did want to do. I didn't want to be a rock star, but I did want to be a professional athlete. So I would say that.
What
And,
sport?
I probably wasn't very picky, but um, um, I think probably basketball or tennis, which are very different. One's a team sport, one's an individual sport, and I did both
Yeah,
very
right.
seriously, so that was fun.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I think that's what I wanted to do.
Do you imagine retiring?
No. Well, it depends what you mean by retiring. I have this conversation regularly with people. It depends what you mean by retiring. If it means, going to an office, that's one thing. If it means stopping your work, right? So writers don't can keep writing forever. It's a
Sure.
beautiful thing, right? That that you can keep doing. So if I gave up my paid day-to-day job and wrote, would I be retired if I wrote more than I do now? I don't know. But in general, if the notion is, do you want to watch more TV and play with your grandchildren and I don't know, play golf or whatever people do or do more barbecues? No, I want to do none of those things.
Okay. And then your follow-up question you ask, and this is a very different way of this asking about the same topic. Do you think you'll be able to retire?
Yes, I'm very lucky. I could retire now in my
Okay.
60s. I'm in my 60s and I could retire. I could retire and live just fine, but I'm not a particularly picky person or a person who lives at a particularly high level. I don't have fancy clothes, cars, or anything that's super expensive, but
Right.
um no, I like the interactions with people. I like being responsible to people. I like having the place in the world that I can help people. Those have been very important to me in my life, and I would miss all of those very much to sort of retire and center on my own things is not appealing particularly to me.
Fair enough. And you've written 15 books. What's next for you?
15 more?
I don't know. You tell me.
I don't no, I don't know. I have other projects. Certainly, I have other writing projects that I'm doing
Yeah.
right now, and we'll see where they go. I like that.
All
I
right.
like that very well. I mean,
All right.
I hope that the industries that I'm in survive.
Yeah.
Public health is under attack. Academic research is under attack. Seeing patients who are poor, they're going to suffer because there aren't many doctors like me who can afford to see them. It's under attack. The publishing industry is under attack. So I feel like, a bit of the world that I'm most familiar with and think is important and value is really being upended. And what will come next is uncertain to me. And I will see.
All right. Well, how can people find out more about you and your work?
michaelsteinbooks.org. See all
All
my
right.
books, order my books. This book is called A Living, as you know, and that would be a good one. You can get them on ebooks, you can get them in physical things through electronic bookstores. And yeah, I'd love people to write to me through my website, michaelsteinbooks.org, and tell me what you think. And that's always fun for me. I will answer you.
Excellent. Well, Michael, it's been great having you guest on All Across America. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. What a great set of questions.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.